Napoleon spent 3 days at Eylau, occupied in arranging for the removal of the wounded and in hurrying on the arrival of provisions required for the army. Some days after the battle, he replied to the proposals which the King of Prussia had made to him. He expressed himself anxious to put an end to Prussia's misfortunes. He offered to conclude a separate peace with him and to reorganize the Prussian monarchy, which, as an intermediary power and as a barrier against Russia, was necessary for the tranquility of the whole of Europe. General Bertrand was charged with this letter. The king's answer was brought to Osterode by the Prussian General Kleist, who had orders to add some verbal explanations. The King of Prussia could not resign himself to sign a treaty for which his ally was to be excluded. He proposed the assembly of a Congress at which Prussia, Russia, England, and Sweden should be represented. Prussia had just bound herself to England by a convention and had already received the first installments of an English subsidy. She hoped to find a powerful ally in this state and thought that a treaty made in conjunction with England and Russia would be less disadvantageous to her than a separate peace. The emperor in his turn answered that the inevitable delay of a Congress was not in accordance with the present situation in Prussia, although he also desired to come to an understanding with Russia and England. This correspondence resulted in nothing, though the communications between the headquarters of the belligerent parties were not interrupted during the time which Napoleon spent at Osterode and Finkenstein. From Eylau, the emperor went to take up his winter quarters, first at Osterode, so as to be near his cantonments, and spent the end of February and the whole month of March here. He issued numerous orders from Osterode to provide for means of subsistence, flour, wines, brandies, rums, and beer for the soldiers and the invalids, and forage for the horses. He ordered at the same time that detailed reports on the state of the storehouses, which had been concentrated at Podolsk, Warsaw, and other places, should be laid before him. He asked that the heads of the various corps for information as to how their soldiers were living. Provisions for the soldiers were the first object of his care, and he also paid great attention to the state of the hospitals. Then followed orders to provide for the salubrity and safety of the cantonments, for remounting the cavalry, to bring up distant corps, and thus to reinforce the army, to form provisional regiments at Mayence, and to march them to Potsdam and other places, to recall French divisions, the Polish Legion, and the Polish Lancers from Italy, and to form with the latter an observation corps, the command of which was given to the Polish General Zajączek. Other orders provided for the distribution of the funds allotted to the artillery, to the engineers, to the commissariat, accoutrement, and transport services, for the awarding of recompenses, and for watching the movements of the enemy. On April 1st, Napoleon went to live in the castle of Finkenstein, where he spent the month of April and May. During his stay here, the same labors were the object of his constant activity. He used to make short excursions from Finkenstein to visit the army corps and to see the bridge which he had built over the Vistula. In the prolonged inactivity of his residence in winter quarters, Napoleon showed that he knew how to ally patience and tact with the impetuous outbursts of his genius. Work was his element and beguiled his impatience. The necessity of preparing decisive triumphs to master the enemies who allowed him no hope of safety but in victory, to keep his allies to their duty and to reassure France. All these duties made his time of waiting, so advantageously used by him, appear very short. As a matter of fact, he had barely the time necessary for the operations of the war on the one hand and the care of the government of his vast empire on the other. It was during his stay at the castle of Finkenstein that the emperor heard of the results of General Sebastiani's brilliant embassy to Constantinople. I will not enter into the particulars of the important services which this ambassador rendered to the Porte. on this occasion in the interests of France. Napoleon highly praised the energy and skill with which the General Sebastiani had raised the courage of the Turks and had stimulated them to put their capital and the Bosphorus into a state of defense, as well as the activity and the vigor which he had shown in directing the works himself, and in triumphing over the Ottoman apathy. The complete success obtained by our ambassador made French influence predominant in the Divan. The emperor himself had taken care to keep up the Sultan's favorable feelings towards France. He kept writing him pressing letters, urging him to place himself at the head of his troops, reminding him of the glory of the Selims and the Amuraths. In one word, he had aroused in this weak but really gifted prince a feeling of generous indignation against the oppression of England. Selim, in his enthusiasm for Napoleon and disobeying the laws of the Quran, which forbids all representations of the human face, had desired to have a portrait of the emperor, following the example of Sultan Mustafa, who, in his admiration for the great Frederick, had placed a portrait of this king in his seraglio, the only portrait that had ever entered its doors. Selim, in exchange, sent the emperor his portrait, which was placed in the emperor's cabinet. It was the Chevalier Amédée Joubert, who, passing through Constantinople on his way back from a diplomatic mission to Persia, brought this portrait together with the portrait of Feth Ali Shah back to Finkenstein. It was at Finkenstein also that the emperor decided on the plan of the monument which he wished to dedicate to the great army, and the erection of which he had ordered on December 2nd, 1806, the buildings of the Magdalene Church, which had been abandoned in an advanced state of construction in 1790, and as to the occupation of which Napoleon had frequently hesitated, were definitely appropriated to this monument. The committee of the Institute charged with the inspection of the plans submitted for the competition had forwarded various plans and had indicated which amongst them they had considered the most suitable. Napoleon had charged Monsieur Fontaine, his architect, to be present at the inspection of the plans, which was to take place at the Ministry of the Interior, and to report to him on the subject. This report not having reached the emperor in time, he decided to accept Monsieur Vignon's plan, which had only obtained the second place, but which pleased the emperor by the grandeur of its dimensions and form. What the emperor wanted was a building, not of the style of modern churches, but which would recall antique monuments and be superior both in majesty and magnificence to the finest buildings which antiquity had bequeathed to us. No wood and nothing but iron, marble, and gold were to be used in the construction of this building. Monsieur Vignon's plan fulfilled some of the necessary conditions, but was wanting in general arrangement and in points of detail. Monsieur Fontaine's remarks made Napoleon regret not to have waited his architect's report before coming to a decision. As the author of the successful plan had no practical experience of building, Monsieur Rondelet, an architect, was associated with Monsieur Vignon to superintend the carrying out of the construction, Monsieur Fontaine having refused the post. Monsieur Rondelet was the most celebrated pupil of the great Soufflot, who on his deathbed had mentioned him as the man most capable of finishing the great cathedral of Saint Genevieve, which has since become the Pantheon. The Madeleine, a grandiose specimen of architecture under the Empire and constructed on the model of the temples of ancient Greece, is not adapted to the requirements of a church. It was proposed to place Napoleon's tomb in this building, and this plan had the advantage of giving the founder of the imperial edifice a last home in a monument at once religious and national, which had been erected under his reign, but the Restoration decided otherwise, and the Madeleine was purely and simply restored to divine worship. The emperor received the Turkish and Persian ambassadors at Finkenstein. Mirza Ritza, a great Persian nobleman, arrived in Warsaw early in March at the same time as the Turkish ambassador. The Persian envoy was summoned towards the end of April to Finkenstein, where he was treated with great respect and put into relations with the Secretary of State, Marais, Duke of Bassano. The negotiations only lasted a few days, and the treaty was signed on May the 8th. The learned Orientalist Jalbert, Dragoman's secretary to the imperial cabinet, acted as intermediary between the two negotiators. The Persian ambassador offered the emperor some pearls and shawls on this occasion, representing them as coming from himself because he feared that they might give a lower idea than he wished of his sovereign. As a good courtier, or from a feeling of national pride, he pretended that his master's presents had not yet arrived, and presented his own, saying that he prayed the lion to receive the gifts of the ant. He accompanied Napoleon to a great review, followed by the emperor step by step amidst the rank of the soldiers, walking on the plowed fields with his beautiful slippers and trailing robe. It was very hot weather, and he returned to Finkenstein quite worn out. Throwing himself on his couch, he kept exclaiming, exhausting the whole vocabulary of admiration. "How great! How fine! How magnificent!" Below his breath, he muttered, "I am dying of fatigue." The emperor used to walk out with him in the gardens of Finkenstein every day. One day, the poor ambassador found himself in a very awkward position. His supply of henna had run out, a red substance which he used for dyeing his nails and the palms of his hands. And he was as much ashamed to appear before the emperor with white hands as the habitué of our drawing rooms in Paris would have been to present himself without gloves. One day the conversation turned on the history of Alexander, and the ambassador said that the true history of this conqueror was to be found in Persia. Mirza Ritza departed on his way back home immediately after the signing of the treaty. He was followed shortly afterwards by General Garden, the emperor's aide-de-camp, who was accredited as ambassador to the court of Tehran. Napoleon at the same time sent some distinguished officers to be attached to his legation. They were intended to act as instructors and auxiliaries to the Persian army. As to General Garden, who went to Tehran in the hopes of finding a treasure which had formerly been buried in this capital by his grandfather, his searches were in vain. The Turkish ambassador, Saib Vahid Emin Effendi, arrived in Finkenstein a month later. He was as much lacking in wit and intelligence as Mirza Ritza had been distinguished for these qualities, and was essentially a formal and fastidious person. Commissioned to tighten the bonds of friendship which united us to Turkey, he did not consider himself vested with sufficient powers to conclude a real alliance. During a conference which took place between him and the emperor in the garden of the castle of Finkenstein, Napoleon urged him to conclude, making signs with his hands to try and make the Turkish ambassador understand that the Russians had made us proposals of peace. At last, to compel him to come to a decision, the emperor declared to him that if no arrangement was come to between France and Turkey, peace would inevitably be made with Russia to the exclusion of the Porte. Vahid contented himself with answering that he needed fresh instructions, that the answer to his letter would not occasion a delay of more than 40 days, and that he begged the emperor to wait. Napoleon, who could not submit to delay, was made very impatient by this obstinacy. In the meanwhile, events were progressing, and in the interest of the campaign, Napoleon left for Danzig. He summoned the Turkish ambassador to join him there and to continue the negotiations with the Duke of Caulaincourt, who was not a whit more successful. All these conferences came to nothing, and hostilities with the Russians recommenced. Vahid Effendi proceeded to Paris, where he soon heard of Sultan Selim's decision, which deprived him of his powers. The Treaty of Tilsit was signed, and Turkey had missed her opportunity of uniting herself in a close alliance with France, which would have been advantageous to both states. The failure of Napoleon's efforts to bring the port into this line of action was of a nature to cool his feelings towards the state. However, in spite of the obstinacy which had been shown in these delays, either owing to the incapacity of the representative to Finkenstein or to the influence of Russia on the divan, the good understanding between Turkey and France did not appear to be in the least diminished. But Monsieur de Talleyrand showed himself very offended that anybody but himself should have been chosen to treat either with Turkey or with Persia. The war with Sweden continued. Marshal Mortier received orders to occupy Pomerania and to besiege Stralsund, the garrison of which was a menace to our lines of communication. The emperor considered the war with Sweden bad policy. He bitterly regretted that the Swedes had set fire to the fine Faubourg de Stralsund and that 2,000 of the inhabitants were in consequence homeless. He deplored the sufferings caused to a nation which was our natural ally. He had, in consequence, expressed a wish to Marshal Mortier that a suspension of hostilities might be concluded, thanks to which friendly relations might once more be established between the Swedes and ourselves. This wish for a truce was realized, although no definite treaty of peace was concluded. An armistice, which had been granted for a period of 10 days only, and which the emperor had prolonged, lasted until about the middle of July. Peace had just been signed at Tilsit when the armistice was broken by the King of Sweden. It looked as if he had awaited the very moment when Napoleon could dispose of all his forces to commit this imprudent act. The Swedes were thereupon expelled from Pomerania, which was occupied by the French troops, as also from Stralsund and the island of Rügen. The king, having in this way lost his possessions in Germany, returned to Sweden. During his stay at Osterode, the emperor had undertaken the siege of Danzig, which, for the success of his military operations, it was highly important for him to occupy. He had intended to appoint Marshal Victor to the command of the besieging army, but this soldier was taken prisoner on his way to his post by the Prussian Schill, whom we shall see play a more important part in the War of 1809 against Austria. Marshal Lefebvre was then commissioned to conduct the siege. Marshal Kalkreuth, on his side, defending Danzig with stubborn courage. The Emperor Alexander and the King of Prussia, feeling how necessary it was to save this fortified place, sent reinforcements, but all their attempts to raise the siege were in vain. An English corvette, the Saint-Père, without fear, carrying 24 cannons and freighted with powder and cannonballs, was boarded and captured by a picket of the regiment of Paris. Lacking, it is true, in deep science, Marshal Lefebvre displayed all his bravery and all his activity in the task which had been entrusted to him, and General Chasseloup directed the operations of the siege with skill. At last, after a resistance of 2 months, which did great credit to the Prussian general, at the very moment when the town was going to be taken by storm, Kalkreuth asked to capitulate. In recognition of his brave defense, Napoleon granted him honorable terms. The same day, Marshal Lefebvre made his entry into the town. It was at Finkenstein on May 29th that the emperor heard the news of the surrender of Danzig. He at once sent General Rapp to take over the command of this place. Napoleon went himself to spend 2 days there and to visit his new conquest. He approved of the works which had been executed by the engineers and complimented Marshal Lefebvre on his splendid conduct. He created him Duke of Danzig and handsomely endowed the new title. He authorized him to accept a considerable sum of money, the exact amount of which I forget, which the states had offered of their own accord to the marshal, but which he had refused to accept without the emperor's permission. On leaving the sovereign, the new duke slipped. He was not superstitious, and so, picking himself up, he said good-naturedly, "My God, my good town of Danzig is badly paved." Napoleon, having distributed numerous rewards amongst the soldiers who had taken part in this siege, returned to Finkenstein by way of Marienburg to prepare to resume the offensive.